Good afternoon. I'm Ilsa Connect, and I'm the Deputy Director of Public Policy for the National Center for Victims of Crime. Thanks for waiting for us. We had a little technical glitch, but I think we should be going on well here. Let us know if you're having any issues. I want to just start today by talking for just a minute about the National Center for Victims of Crime. This is the No More Harm webinar. We're going to be talking about untested sexual assault kits and communities of color today. I want to say a little bit about the National Center. Our mission is to forge a national commitment to help victims of crime rebuild their lives. And we are a 25-year-old national resource and advocacy organization that works to help all victims of all types of crime to help them rebuild their lives. And we do this through advocacy for victims' rights and funding for victim services and training and technical assistance projects. And we work a lot with those who provide assistance and support to victims of crime. We are very grateful to be funded by the Office on Violence Against Women to help communities that are dealing with untested sexual assault kit problems and to help them create a victim-sensitive approach to dealing with that backlog of untested kits. And to ensure that our project is victim-informed, in 2012 we held a roundtable with survivors whose kits had been untested for many years, some as long as 25 years. And we learned a lot about those from the survivors about what worked for them and what didn't in these type of cases. And a brief report about that is on our website, which I'll give you in just a minute. And under this grant, we have also created an online resource collection that includes policies and protocols on victim notification, state and federal laws, pending legislation related to untested sexual assault kits, news, and materials and resources related to these cases and working with victims in these cases. We are providing technical assistance to many communities, for example, with creating a victim notification protocol and training, such as this webinar. And we're also doing in-person trainings as well. Here is a list of our upcoming webinars. All of these you can sign up for on our website. You can see we'll be talking about untested sexual assault kits and crime victims' rights in December. In January, we'll be having Dr. David Lisak talk about sex offending and testing of rape kits and why we should be testing all rape kits. In March, we'll be with Kim Worthy from Wayne County in Detroit, and she'll be talking about their project there and working with cold case sexual assault survivors. This is our DNA Resource Center website. You can sign up for those webinars at this website, and you can check out all of our resources on untested sexual assault kits as well as other resources on the use of forensic DNA in the criminal justice system. Okay, on to our most accomplished speakers. We have two wonderful experienced speakers to talk to us today about communities of color and untested sexual assault kits. And I want to say this webinar, I'm very glad it's happening today. It's been a long time in the making, and we finally were able to get these two experts with us today to tell us about what we should know about working with victims in communities of color. Condencia Brade is the co-founder and executive director for the National Organization of Sisters of Color Ending Sexual Assault, or CSAE. CSAE is a women of color-led nonprofit committed to ensuring that system-wide policies and social change initiatives related to sexual assault are informed by critical input and direction of women of color. As a national advocacy organization, CSAE utilizes a multi-strategy approach of leadership enhancement and support for women of color, advocacy and support for organizations by and for communities of color, as well as technical assistance, training, and systems advocacy regarding sexual assault in communities of color. Condencia has worked on issues related to sexual assault, for years. Debi Cain is the executive director of the Michigan Domestic and Sexual Violence Prevention and Treatment Board. Debi spent the first 15 years of her career as the founding executive director of Haven, a suburban Detroit area sexual assault and domestic violence agency. Debi then spent 4 years as the director of the Sexual Assault Prevention and Awareness Center at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. She has been involved in developing training curriculum for judges, police, child welfare staff, prosecutors, welfare workers, domestic violence, and sexual assault program staff. Debi has received various awards for her work and dedication to the field. So I'm glad to have you both here to talk about this very important topic, and I'm looking forward to learning a lot from you that will help me in my work with communities across the nation that have untested kits. So let's get started. We're going to start with Debi Cain. And I need to unmute Debi. Are you muted, Debi? Yes.
Hi.
There you are. Okay.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Elsa. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today with my friend and colleague, Condencia. What we're hoping for is that we can have an analytical and philosophic dialogue addressing the needs of sexual assault survivors within communities of color, particularly in the context of communities where there have been large-scale untested kits sitting there. And we hope to particularly address the unique challenges that communities of color, survivors of color face, along with strategies for working with them. So I'd like to start by giving some information. And Ilsa, it's not moving for me, the PowerPoint, so.
Okay, let's see. There you go.
Okay. Great, thank you. Let me give just a little bit of context to the 400 project and what we worked on with that. The 400 project came about because of over 11,000 untested, largely untested sexual assault kits that dated back to the 1980s and were sitting in the property room of the Detroit Police Department. We had been approached by the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office, by Prosecutor Kim Worthy, and the Michigan State Police Laboratory and others about working together on a quote-unquote audit of what those kits looked like. And initially, in setting up the 400 project, what we were really looking at was trying to figure out what those kits consisted of. And so for planning purposes, we knew what kind of personnel and resources would be needed. We were fortunate that in our office, and we are a government office, although the first 20-some years of my career was in the nonprofit world in sexual assault and domestic violence. My last 12 have been working for a state government organization where we also do funding. And we had just received from the Office on Violence Against Women ARA dollars, and OVW was very gracious in allowing us to establish the 400 project. Again, the intent was really looking at those untested kits. The history of that included that we tried to look at who we thought the demographics would be, and there are a couple of interesting things that I wanted to point out to you about that. One was that the city of Detroit has a population of almost 90% African American community, and a largely impoverished urban base in the population. We were also looking at the fact that demographically we knew that there's a very young population that we might be looking at, and we assumed initially that we would also be seeing people from suburban Detroit who would be coming in as people who might work in the city of Detroit or be visiting for Tigers games or other kinds of events and such that were going on and might have actually been sexually assaulted in the city of Detroit. So I want to tell you just a little bit of things that we learned, but I also want to clarify first that my role in this project, because we are the funding agency, the board for which I'm the executive director, was overseeing and coordinating the project with other stakeholders who were with us, but I was not serving in the capacity of an advocate. So the opinions that I'll be expressing with you today on behalf of some of what we saw with survivors are things that came out of many meetings and reviewing case files and notes and that kind of thing, but they all reflect my personal opinion, not of that of the 400 project or the other participants. And any case examples that I give, I will have changed or consolidated the information so that there's nothing that's identifying about that case. I want to particularly give kudos, and we'll come back to this a little bit later, but it was a group process. We think we were the first of a large-scale project like this, where victim advocates were at the table and SANES were at the table every step of the way from beginning to end. But we also had amazing partnership with our friends at the Michigan State Police Lab, who did a yeoman's job on all of this, and our colleagues from the Prosecuting Attorneys Association of Michigan. And I particularly want to pay homage to the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office and Prosecutor Kim Worthy for being instrumental in bringing this to the table and looking at the community. What we did see was that the large percentage of the cases were exactly the population of the city of Detroit, that 90% of the victims roughly were African American. Over 50% of them were in the 13 to 22-year-old age range, primarily female. And that what we were surprised to see was that we had virtually very, very small numbers of anybody as a victim or survivor who was not a resident of the city of Detroit. And so our theory and thinking about what we might have expected with people coming into the city, we did not see that. And we've done some theorizing that perhaps what may have happened is that people drove back into their communities outside of Detroit and went to local hospitals. And according to Michigan law, the police department where the assault occurred is the department that would have to go pick up the kit from the hospital for chain of evidence, and that perhaps those kits were never picked up. Unfortunately, these cases dated back to the 1980s, and so we had no way of knowing that, and it was really nothing more than a theory. The other thing that I just want to mention, and we're going to come back to this again a little bit later, is just the complete level of shock that I had as someone living in the metropolitan Detroit area myself, by how little outrage there really was about the news that there were 11,000 of these kits sitting on shelves basically being ignored. When we talk about backlogged kits, that means, according to NIJ, they've gone to the lab and they're sitting there. And I want to say on behalf of our friends at the Michigan State Police Lab, these are kits that never even made it to their laboratory. These are kits that sat in an evidence room. So with all that in mind, Condencia, I'd like to turn it over to you and ask you, as you've heard what I've described about the 400 project and the victim or survivor population that we've looked at, what is the context of these untested kits and their impact on the community from your vantage point?
Thanks, Debbie. I think, as we talk about the context for these kits, I want to kind of give you a sense of this idea of when we talk about sexual assault in communities of color, and then how does the idea of these kits being untested then play into that. So let me start by saying that sexual assault, as we all know, it's a complex issue. It's a complex issue overall. And it's even more so in communities of color. Not that communities of color have any more sexual assault than other communities, or is more, they are more prevalent to sexual assault in more communities, but there are vulnerabilities that oftentimes will impact on the occurrence and the healing from sexual assault in communities of color. This complexity is heightened when people of color are often portrayed and viewed by the media, by some in mainstream, as being less than, where women of color are often devalued and men of color are often seen as violent. Then there are the systems and systemic responses to communities of color that are so entrenched that even when the system provider looks like you, you are still devalued. There are so many institutionalized racism that is oftentimes in many of our systems that when communities of color are often trying to interact with those systems, it comes away leaving oftentimes less than satisfied. Because then what happens is many communities of color have internalized these lessons of being told that you're devalued, of interacting with systems and then you're devalued in those systems. And oftentimes those lessons come across saying to us that we're less than deserving. Then we enter the issue of DNA, where there are profound concerns about how DNA is obtained when it comes to communities of color. And there's a struggle with the context and the historical context of DNA within communities of color. Then we add another layer, And we look at what many of you know, that the majority of sexual assault victims choose not to report to law enforcement or even tell anyone about the assault for a variety of reasons. But now let's look at this through the lens of what far too many women of color are often having to deal with. Women of color who are often seen as asking for it or as liking it or being over-sexualized, or that they are working for it, or that they are too strong to be a victim, or they're too weak to speak up, or that they're keeping quiet to protect their men or their community. And the list goes on, telling many women of color who you are supposed to be. But you're struggling to deal with being hurt, with being violated, with being traumatized, sometimes not even understanding what happened or how it happened to you. There's a struggle to speak up, to stand up for your rights, while knowing that you will be seen within your community and outside of your community as giving up your community. You open historical wounds that are very raw and right beneath the surface. But yet, many women of color who survive sexual assault, they make the decision to speak up in different ways, some without saying a word, some by choosing to trust the system that oftentimes we've been taught not to trust. But we trust them anyway, to seek justice, to believe that it will be different and we will get justice, to go through the grueling, invasive evidence kit again to get justice. And then nothing happens. That is why this conversation is so important. That is why Debbie and I are sharing our thoughts with you today. And it's important not to generalize, because all survivors of sexual assault are not the same. All women of color and communities of color are not the same. But there are some nuances that are important to consider when addressing untested kits and its impact on communities of color. And that is what we hope to leave with you today. Not answers, because quite frankly, if we had answers, we would not be needing to have these conversations, but rather things to consider as you move forward in addressing untested kits. Having kind of looked at that context, I wonder, Debbie, if you could share if you saw any of the things that I kind of alluded to just now reflected in Detroit. For instance, you started talking about the reaction of the community and the lessons that you learned from their reactions. Can you talk more about that?
Absolutely. What you're describing, Condencia, is much of what we actually did see. As we think about the community response, again, Prosecutor Kim Worthy did a phenomenal job of working with media and really trying to bring public attention to this. What she knew, what we all knew, was that as kits were then tested, that there would be a need for additional resources, for the lab to do that testing, for police to investigate, for prosecutors to be able to prosecute in those cases where it was possible, and importantly, in all of the cases, for victim advocates to be present to offer services and support for victims and survivors of sexual assault. And the irony and the really sad thing for me as someone who lives in suburban Detroit is the complete lack of outrage that there was at a community level anywhere in Southeast Michigan about the fact that this had occurred. Within the sexual assault community, for instance, we had really looked at and planned for, as newspaper articles were breaking and we knew that there would be different media going on about the existence of these kits and that the 400 Project would be testing those kits. What we anticipated was that many of those 11,000 victims or survivors might be calling crisis lines and saying, am I in that 400 that would be tested? And what does this mean for my case? And will you be testing all of the kits, et cetera, et cetera? And so we had, as a funder and monitor of all the sexual assault programs, a meeting with all of the different local community sexual assault programs and talked about preparing people and working together on how we could be helpful to survivors who would actually be calling into crisis lines. And sadly, to this day, and we're talking 3 or 4 years later now, we are not aware of more than a handful of phone calls that ever came in from survivors or family members asking for any additional information or asking whether they were part of that. We did get some survivor calls, and ironically, they were from people who had not been sexually assaulted in the city of Detroit. They were from the surrounding areas, but from within the city of Detroit, we just never got that kind of response. And there are a lot of things that we theorize about that, but certainly that lack of outrage by the community that this could have happened, and a driving need to know what would happen next simply did not ever happen. As we look at knowing your community and all of your community, I think there were many lessons learned for all of us in each of our disciplines. In sexual assault programs, for instance, we came to understand as we worked with the sexual assault programs in Southeast Michigan that dealing with relatively current cases that are going through or potentially going through the criminal justice process is an extremely different venture than dealing with cases that went back, to the 1980s, some of them. And so for those of you who deal with cold cases, that's probably not news. But in Michigan, we have very little cold case work that's done around criminal sexual conduct. And so that's really not something that most of us in sexual assault programs had been trained for or were acclimated or had a lot of experience in doing. What we found then with police was that, it was very different for them in knowing how to investigate and that kind of thing. And all of that then in knowing who your community is that it's easy in our own disciplines to make or to have a belief system that the people that we see reflect the community of sexual assault survivors at large. And in reality, what we saw in this particular situation with the 400 project was it didn't reflect at all who or what we thought would happen. And that goes along then with the making no assumptions. We saw, contrary to the national statistics, and maybe this is something that's about urban areas, I don't know, but what we saw was a disproportionately higher rate of stranger assaults than the national data or what most people in rape crisis centers would actually expect to see. That makes a big difference when you think then about what work may be done around triaging. And so, looking at that and what it meant was hugely important. It was also important in terms of what did it mean to look at somebody who was a stranger. And in some cases, people were not classified as strangers because she knew a street name for the guy. She didn't know who he was or where he lived, but she did know a street name. So should that be a stranger? Should it be, a non-stranger? And again, I mentioned the assumptions we made about more people being assaulted from outside the city of Detroit who might be there for many hours every week because of working there. So those were some of the things that we did notice. Do any of those surprise you, Condencia?
Not really, because I think what was also interesting is when you talked about the context of stranger and the context of what does the idea of a stranger mean within an urban community, particularly because oftentimes we don't think about urban communities as being small communities. But for communities of color, urban communities are much like that because even though it might be a large area, there are sub-pockets and sub-communities across that urban area. And so it's almost like being in a small rural community because, folks know one another. And you may not know, that's absolutely correct, you may not necessarily know the person by name, but it's the person that you see every time you go to your cultural neighborhood or the person that you pass by on your front door, or that he may be so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so's cousin's brother. So I think that the context of this idea of stranger is very important, and it's very relevant when you're talking about communities of color. And this also goes to when we think about, oftentimes we think that these might be opportunities where folks say, I'm going to, many survivors in general tend to, they look over their shoulder when they're not quite sure, they don't know for sure, they look over their shoulder. They're constantly looking at that. But when we're talking about women of color, there's a heightened sense of that. because their community is right there. And even if the survivor may want to leave that neighborhood, often that's a huge issue for them. Often there's a struggle because it is your community, and there's that push of pull. It's this is where I know, this is where I feel safe in some matter, and even though the assault might have happened there. So I think that when we look at that and then we look at that nothing has happened and nothing has been done over years, you're right in there. And in some cases, you might have an idea, or people might talk, or, you know, the minute that you decided to go to the police, people started talking more. And so there might be conversation about who they might have thought that it was or who might have done it. And you've had to, as a woman of color, you've had to think about that and be able to live within your sense of safety, given that nothing has been done. Thanks, Debi. And then, you know, Debi, it also raises for me, I'm wondering, when you started doing this, what are some of the things that you heard from survivors?
Well, as you might expect, we saw the full range of reactions from survivors. And again, I really give kudos especially to Samara Ho, who was one of the advocates who was working directly with survivors. There were those who were very glad to finally hear from someone, and they wanted to proceed with the case. And there were others who never wanted to hear from anybody ever and were angry when someone showed up on their doorstep. You can see in the PowerPoint that some of the reactions that we had from people, and again, this was, you know, based on a context that these cases went back 20 and 30 years, was, why are you here now? I filed this report years and years ago. I had that kit done years and years ago. Why didn't you follow up with me at the time of my assault? Contrary to the expectations that some people might have had, the vast majority of victims that we did contact indicated that they had every intention of proceeding with the case, that they had the kit done and made the report because they did want to proceed with the case. And so to not have heard from anybody for all that time and then why now, you know, was something that they would raise. And what is it you want from me now? And, you know, again, we're talking years and years later and opening up, you know, something that is perhaps the person has put away or put into a context, and now we're suddenly reopening that wound and making them relive something again. So what is it you want from me? And in our case, when we were doing victim notifications, what it meant was that we had a CODIS hit. If we didn't get any information, we did not notify the victim of the case. And there were a lot of reasons, which is a whole other big conversation. But if we were notifying a victim from the 400 project, we were notifying them because we did get a CODIS hit in their case. And for many of them, what they said is, this isn't even one of the worst things that's happened to me. Worst things that happened to me before and or since then. So, you know, why are you here now? There are a couple of other things I wanted to mention about that, and I think this, one of them feeds right into what you were saying earlier, Condencia, and that is that while people were often angry and disappointed that nobody followed up with them previously, they also expressed such low expectations. We repeatedly heard that, well, I'm not surprised. I never really thought anybody would get back to me. And just the number of times that that came up, it's staggering. We really tried to factor in that, again, thinking about this from systems vantage points, for advocates, this was a very different experience because generally sexual assault survivors may be reaching out to us years later, but not in the context of a criminal justice approach. They may be calling about something that happened years ago, but it's not part of the criminal justice system. If it is, it tends to be more a current case. So it was a very different time to enter into a survivor's life when now not only is she being perhaps for the first time looking at services that are available to her, but they're much later, and suddenly a case that she was willing to pursue years ago is now back on the table. One thing I do want to mention, and I thought this was a really exceptional way. You talked to Condencia about, what it means to communities of color to suddenly have the police show up at your home and that kind of thing. And the investigators that have been working on this and the subsequent projects for NIJ, which is 1,600 more cases in addition to the initial 400 in the 400 project, one of the women investigators, Ann Kanitra, has been, they're amazing. They actually look for built-in reasons that they can tell the survivor immediately. So if they call and say that, they'd like to meet with her and they can come by or she can come to them, if they do go to her home, they do give her a reason that they can say, well, you can tell them that we're, going out in the neighborhood looking for a person or whatever, so that the survivor has a reason built in. But again, I just really want to express that while there's that range of emotions, the reality is many of them knew that police didn't believe them, and many of them really didn't expect that they were going to get much from them. So that seems totally consistent with what you were saying, Condencia, and it probably doesn't surprise you, but I'm just curious as to what your reaction to that is.
Well, yes, Debbie. Unfortunately, it doesn't surprise me because, as I mentioned before, there is, although not all people of color are the same, we're certainly all very different. Yet we're often generalized as a population to be less than, to be non-deserving, to be trying to live off the system, et cetera. And, and when you're told something about yourself often enough, there's a struggle not to believe it. Whether even when you know intuitively better, there's a struggle not to believe that within yourself. And it's a struggle to expect things to be different. So when something happens that proves the point, as my friend would say, your thought becomes, well, there you go. And so in the struggle to move forward with the kit and then nothing to have happened, then you can hear that voice in your head saying, well, what did you expect? And the struggle that may be different, the other struggle rather, is that we're talking about communities of color, and when we're thinking about a woman of color as a survivor, that there is often no inherent sense of privilege. For many communities of color, we don't expect things to be easy. Often we don't expect things to go right for us. We expect to struggle. And even when you tell yourself that if you work hard for things are going to be different, there's so much that's telling you differently. And I think that, that's some of what you're hearing and the context of that. The other thing is that, in general, across all survivors, some will see addressing the backlog as positive, and some will see as negative. And as you mentioned, Debbie, this stands true for women of color as well. However, you will find that many more women of color will see this as an intrusion into their lives with lots of anger and resentment. Because as I said before, they still live in the neighborhood. And so whatever that neighborhood may be in the context of that, and have had to figure out how to continue doing that for all these. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a struggling with systemic responses for communities of color, and we often don't expect systems to respect us. And unfortunately, when it comes to law enforcement and the criminal justice system, it's one place where, although there are some good folks doing good work within the criminal justice system, it's unfortunately often a place for injustice for many communities of color. And so to have something so traumatic ignored by this very same system, well, again, it feels like, there you go. And the sentiment can sound like, now, here you come knocking on my door after you've done messed up once again, after you've ignored me once again. And this, it's seen as a constant disregard by systems, as justice is something to, unfortunately, a good friend of mine says, sometimes justice is seen as something to lock us up and not to protect us. Which, it's unfortunate.
Yep, absolutely.
And Debbie, you and I talked a little bit about this idea of apology. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, some of the issues that we really grappled with in the 400 project included apology. As we began reaching out to people and as you began, looking at the reality that there were 11,000 kits. Now, some of them had been tested and they had been put back in the evidence room. Some of them had been adjudicated, and so there wasn't a testing that occurred. But the vast majority of them were kits that basically had been shelved and were ignored. And so we talked a lot as a group about how do we deal with the issue of apology. Here we are going in, we're reopening old wounds for people, and the reality was that although we didn't want to get into a blame game in a way that would shut down system partnerships or not allow victims to move forward, we did feel that to just knock on somebody's door and say, hey, remember that kit that you submitted to in the police report you filed in 1991? Well, turns out we didn't do anything with it until recently, and now we do have a CODIS hit, and we've identified who the person who committed that assault was. So you're interested in going forward with it. And so we struggled a lot with the whole issue of where does apology fit in. For those of you who are not familiar with the work of Lee Taft, it's L-E-E, Taft, T-A-F-T. Lee is an amazing, amazing human being. He is an attorney, actually a former medical malpractice attorney, who works a lot with authentic apology and really looking at where that fits in. And again, that would be a whole half day just to talk about that alone. But we didn't, any of us, feel good about going in. We had looked at police reports, and some of them literally came out and said they didn't believe the victim. And some of them had very uncomplimentary things written in them. Now, that wasn't all of them, and there were also some very well, very good police reports. But the reality is that every system in one way or another had really let survivors and victims down. So that's an area that we grappled with about what does that mean. And even if we look at the issue of apology, and there's a whole range of that, everything from doing something like South Africa did, where you do a global apology, to more individualized apologies, which is what we tended to do in the notifications that we were doing. There are litigation issues that you have to look at, but there was also, in one of the examples that Lee gave, point of context, and particularly with communities of color, is so important. He had worked on a particular case in Dallas, and while a formal apology and restitution was made from the city, everything was covered in mainstream media. And after the fact, the few survivors who had been victims of the Dallas Police Department expressed a concern because it wasn't the people they wanted to know about the apology. It's their church, it was their neighborhood, it was their own community, and that wasn't who really got the notifications through mainstream media. So that whole issue of apology is one that we still talk about and grapple with, and we certainly haven't come to terms with it, but it's huge. To just knock on somebody's door and pretend like, hey, this is a normal thing, never felt right to us. We also grappled a lot with how do you meet survivors with where they are now. And again, looking at the fact that I think back to my own career starting as a sexual assault advocate at the age of 21, and pretty early on working with women and wanting to talk to them about the sexual assault and that it wasn't their fault and all of those kinds of things. And I remember one young woman who looked at me, she was about my same age, and she said, hey, this isn't even one of the worst things that's ever happened to me. These two guys broke into my home, they pistol whipped me in front of my kids, my door is broken, people in my neighborhood are going to steal everything I have. I don't have any money to replace those things or any money to fix my door. That's what I care about at this moment in time. And we certainly saw that time after time in dealing with women where, again, they'd had years to come to terms with this, and many things had happened for good and for bad to them since then. So that whole change in what her priorities are now, and very often those priorities were, I'm worried about being evicted from where I'm living. I've lost my kids temporarily to the foster care system, and I need help with that. I can't deal with something that happened years and years ago. I need to deal with this. And I think all of that brings up the third point, which is, where do and how do traditional sexual assault approaches and services work in situations where we're dealing with very impoverished communities of color? And I guess I'd ask you that, Condencia. What are some of the culturally relevant approaches that you would recommend?
Thanks, Debbie. I think that, as we said earlier, that definitely what I want to make sure that folks don't take away is that there's a quick answer to all of this, but that it does require, doing some work around this. And number one being to educate yourself and your team that will be responding to the untested kits about the context of sexual assault in communities of color in your area. It's more than being sensitive, it's being proactive, and it's being intentional. It's using this as an opportunity to examine your current policies and protocols that create a barrier for communities of color to access your services. It's also knowing that there's a difference between, it's also, actually, back up, it's also about partnering with culture-specific community-based communities of color organizations in your area, those that have an understanding of the dynamics of sexual assault and that offer services that are informed and created by and for the realities of the communities of color in your area and their cultural way of healing. And I can't stress that enough, because I think it's one thing for me to be able to give you a context across sexual assault about things to think about, but it would be irresponsible for me to say, this is what you do for this community versus this community, because all communities are different, and all communities of color are different. And it's important that you know who is in your community, as we said earlier. And then it's also important that you be willing to have conversation that is intentional. It's about being willing to say, I need to know a little bit more and I need your help, and being willing to work with those communities to say, let's look at what does this mean? What you know about your community, about sexual assault within your community, what does that mean in terms of the way we're going to share the information about these untested kits? How we're going to share the information, when we're going to share the information, who is going to be the one that's going to provide the information, and in what context. And I think, like you said, Debbie, knowing that in this community, this is what's going on for us. This is what's happening. This is the reality for our communities. And then what does that mean about who knocks on the door, whether you are going to knock on the door or whether you're going to make a call, and how that's going to be done. And those things can only be done by working with the communities of color in your area and hand in hand being willing to address those and be willing to have those conversations with them and invite them to be part of the conversation in a valuable way. It also means, knowing that there's a difference between being culturally relevant and being culturally competent. I encourage you to work with and to contact your sexual assault programs in your area. That's very important. But it's also important to know that a sexual assault program can be culturally competent, having an understanding of the dynamic of sexual assault in various cultures, and even having programming that is focused on that community. But yet that is still very different than having a community of color organization that is culturally relevant, that those services, again, are created by and for that community and steeped in the realities of that community. And so ideally, you'd be working with both. Or if the community of color organization has a background in sexual assault, then you'd be working with the community of color organization. But please, I can't say enough, don't just stop at the sexual assault program, because again, that may not know all the nuances of what's going on within the communities of color that you're working with. And if you don't know who they are or where they are, and again, talk to your local sexual assault coalition. But if your local sexual assault coalition doesn't know, I'm happy to say, contact us. There are many of us at the national level, and CSA does work with a number of communities of color organizations across the country. So reach out to us if you need to. But again, start with your sexual assault coalition. If they don't know where they exist, where they are, or contact for them, then please do reach out to us. Also know that the issue of sexual assault is a struggle for many communities of color, and communities of color are no different. And so when you reach out, you also have to know that, I know some folks have said, well, what if we start at, the local church or the local community center and start by working with them? And that may be a start, but they may not understand the concept of sexual assault. And so you either have to be working with them and the Sexual Assault Coalition, again, or if trying to find a local community of color organizations that addresses sexual assault. Also, I think it's important to reach out and offer some cross-training to help communities of color understand what's really going on with the untested kits and what is the complexity of the issue. Many, and I've spoken to communities of color advocates across this country, many who do not understand more than what they might have read in the newspaper, which does not give a comprehensive context of what this issue is. And so I think that one of your roles is to partner with them, to, as you're getting information, to be willing to share information about the comprehensive issue, where things are at, what are the steps that you're wanting to take, what is the full picture of what's the untested kits that we're talking about. As community of color organizations understand more, they can better help you to formulate action steps. But again, like I said, be open and willing to accept their input on the protocols for untested kits and how and when and who shares those information. Debbie, do you have any other final thoughts on that?
Nope, that sounds good. So I think we're moving on then to our final thoughts or some of the takeaways that we might have for people. Does that make sense, Condencia?
Absolutely.
So one I'd like to mention is, again, engaging the broad range of stakeholders. As we had the opportunity in Detroit to look at how we would approach the 400 project, we looked around at what others in the country were doing, having experienced similar kinds of situations. And one of the things that we noted was that most of the time there weren't victim voices at the table, there weren't advocates at the table, and there weren't SANEs at the table. And so we felt very strongly that was important. And I have to say that embracing a broad range of stakeholders was one of the things that I think we all felt best about and proudest of. A few years ago, until the 400 project came up, for instance, we didn't know about our friends at the forensic laboratory, and now we love them. We work with them all the time in so many ways that can change policies and procedures and practices, and we've learned so much from them and hopefully they from us in engaging in this work together. We've actually had the luxury with the 400 project of meeting and getting to work with some statisticians from Michigan State University. And so really looking at all of that and even engaging at the encouragement of Prosecutor Worthy in working with the Innocence Project to ensure that not only could we track down and find rapists who had previously gotten away, but also to ensure that we weren't finding any cases, or if we were, that we were dealing with of somebody who'd been falsely convicted in a case. So that broad range of stakeholders was incredibly important. The other thing I would say about the stakeholders is we really have tried to stay focused in a very, very consistent way, that our goal is to ensure that everything from victim notification to the testing of kits really encompasses a multidisciplinary team that's thought about process and practices that are victim-centered and offender-focused. But we've also come to realize, as we've looked at this, that the reality is, from what we anticipated and what we've experienced, is that some survivors are very happy to have us come forward now, and some of them wish that we had not knocked on their door at a later point in time and reopened all of this for them for lots of different reasons. So many times we've felt as stakeholders that what we have to do is focus on being, striving to be survivor-friendly and create helpful practices, but that the reality is sometimes we're also focusing on what is the least harmful to the most victims. And the final thing I want to mention as a lesson learned, for my colleagues out there who work in both domestic and sexual violence, I started in sexual violence at the age of 21 and then moved into domestic violence not too long after that. But the things I described about meeting people where they are now, and that it's often very basic things like housing and food and those kinds of things that you're dealing with, that's kind of a given in the domestic violence world, because so much of what we've done has been about people who are needing shelter or moving out and that kind of thing. In the sexual assault world, it's often, in my experience, been much different. And we found people who were disappointed that what survivors were not interested in was therapy or more therapeutic support groups or, those kinds of things, that what they did want, at least initially, was the more immediate kinds of things. And So I think that, again, goes back to that whole thing of really meeting survivors where they are and what they need now, despite the fact that we may want to provide them something different. That's not necessarily where they are at the point that we're coming in, especially so much later. Condencia, did you want to take it from here?
Yeah, I think just to wrap up, I think the points that you made were so important. And I think I can't echo enough the idea of meeting survivors where they're at and recognizing that, you know, there's no two, as we know, there's no two survivor that's alike. There's no two communities of color that's necessarily alike. And so although, again, we have nuances that, you know, to know that, you know, you're dealing with folks that are going to be very different from community to community, and even within the community and the sub-pockets and sub-communities within the larger urban community. And so being willing to not, you know, assume that what you get from one is going to get from the other, but to meet them where they're at, and knowing that the needs are going to be varied and going to be different. To be intentional. Be intentional. You know, oftentimes, you know, folks say, well, I want to know what it means in terms of, you know, addressing communities of color. And there's a context that says, you know, I want to make sure that I'm doing the right thing. And oftentimes the right thing is to be intentional, And by intentional, it means being willing to recognize what you know, what you don't know, to recognize your limitations, and to take steps to be able to address and get information that you don't know. Not to make assumptions about communities of color, but to recognize, you know, the pieces that you don't know. But again, be intentional about looking for ways to educate yourself. And I can't stress enough the idea of the importance of community, especially, as I said before, in urban neighborhoods. Like I said, these pockets are like sub-communities in which folks know each other, and they're informal leaders that can help you in a lot of ways. And oftentimes, the response of the community affects the victim-survivor willingness to move forward. And I want to wrap up by saying that, you know, Debbie and I were really intentional about just thinking about how much do we want to share, how much do we want to give, how much information do we want to put out there. But one thing that kind of crossed all of that was to know that in sharing this information with you, that we're not wanting to give you a recipe. We talked about Detroit, and it was important for Debbie to share some of the key things that came out in Detroit, as well as for me to share some things in working with communities of color across the country. What we're sharing are things for you to consider, and for you to be, again, the word intentional about taking in and thinking about what does that mean for our community and for how we're going to be moving forward in our work with communities of color. And that, if nothing else, is definitely what we want to make sure that we leave you with, some things to consider and to think about and to be intentional about as you move forward to address untested kids. I think that's it for Debbie and I. Ilsa, do you want to address questions?
Sure. We have a couple. I want to thank you for that. I learned a lot, and taking frantic notes, and I think I want to make sure everybody knows that we did record the webinar, so we'll be able to post it on our website, and you can watch it again or listen to it again if you missed anything. We have two questions, which I'm not sure if this is really a question either one of you can answer, but you can, you know, go for it. How long can a kit be preserved for? Debbie, do you want to talk about that? Or?
You know, I actually don't. I believe in Michigan that while there may be some that, this is what I recall from meetings, so bear with me on this, but I think there's some that perhaps evidence has been damaged because of length of time or the storage process.
Yeah.
And generally, the kits in Michigan don't require refrigeration, and so they can be stored for quite an extended period of time. Mm-hmm. And in the 400, I believe in the vast majority that did have evidence collected that they were able to go forward with the actual testing of them.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it does depend a lot on how they need to be stored, if they need to be refrigerated or not. And I don't know if the question also is maybe related slightly to, you know, there are laws about how long evidence should be retained.
And we unfortunately don't have those laws here in Michigan.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that our board and state partners are currently looking at is evidence retention as an area both for best practice and protocols, but also whether we want to legislate something in regard to that.
Well, I can tell you all, and Debbie, I will send this to you. We just did an evidence retention law chart that is or will be on our website shortly. I'm not sure if it's, I think we are going to be putting it up in the next week, and then we'll send out some kind of announcement about it. And there also is a best practices document that an organization, I'm forgetting the name, it's sort of something on National Institute on Science and Training or something like that, standards and training, science and training, I can't remember, but they have a whole document about that conversation. So those two things will be on our website shortly.
Okay, I look forward to that, Elsa.
Yeah, yeah. Question, if the victim wants nothing to do with it years later, can you still go after the offender?
That's a fascinating question. That's actually something that has been raised by prosecutors in Michigan just recently. And I don't know that we've had full conversations, or I know we haven't had conclusions, but I don't think we've even had full conversations on that yet about whether or not to actually look at victimless prosecution. But that issue has been raised by prosecutors in Michigan that that might be an avenue. I just don't think we've, I know we haven't arrived at any answers about what would be recommended or not in that regard.
Yeah, and from the prosecutors that I've talked to, it has a lot to do, of course, with the facts of the case. When you have a DNA hit, it's not necessarily a slam dunk. All the other facts of the case come in to bear, in terms of documented injuries or, things like that. Or there may be some serial offender where maybe you can bring in other survivors to talk about the, to the trial. So that would be interesting to talk about with one of our prosecutor friends on a webinar, which we might be doing soon. So.
Well, and I think if I can also add too, I think it is a very complicated question because I think there's definitely some layers to it, and then there's certainly this context. When I think about it from the perspective of communities of color, it's it's this piece of what does it mean when it says victimless, and again, it goes back to this idea of, stranger and community and who's in community and, and that part of it. And so, when you're talking about this, you have to really think about this concept of if a victim doesn't want to move forward, I think is what I understand, the victim doesn't want to move forward and you want to move forward anyway, at what cost will that be to the victim, and how will it impact on the victim? And like I said, I think in communities of color where, as I mentioned, the communities are so, so small, the context of what happened, how it happened, all of that stuff, can have significant effect. And we've certainly learned a lot in the social community that, when we think that we can move forward things that, we're only looking at the offender and that's all who's going to be impacted, oftentimes that turns out to be not true. So I think it's definitely, it's definitely lots of conversation, but there's a legal aspect and definitely having, having those, the ethical context as well as the advocacy be a part of that conversation as well.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Good point, Condencia.
Here's a good question. I guess this is for Debbie. Was it a consideration of using people of color when reaching out to the victims or not? Were they more responsive either way?
That is a great question. Yes, I know that the organizations who hired and brought people in definitely took into consideration that the people who would do the notification were representative of the people that they would be going out to see, which in Detroit was primarily African-American population. It wasn't as diverse as we would like for it to have been. And excellent question. I don't actually know that we have a way of gauging other than anecdotally what responses were. Anecdotally, what I will tell you, in having listened to reviews on many of the cases, the thing that struck me the most was that the person doing the outreach's comfort level with sexual assault and doing the actual notification and their experience in doing that seemed to be the most important factor. We have looked at in other situations whether male versus female notification made a difference with police officers or with SANES, and it doesn't seem to, which surprised me. But we don't have any definitive information on that. I can only tell you anecdotally that it did seem to be much more about experience and comfort level of the person doing the notifying than about race.
Condencia, do you want to add anything?
Broadly?
Well, I mean, I think so much of it is all about, I think, as Debi said, it's about the comfort level, and the context. And I think it's going to be different community to community as well. I think, again, that's where, you know, working with the community is going to help. I mean, it definitely, I think in some of the, Debi earlier, and some of the folks that I've worked with and talked with, and some survivors, you know, I think they said things like definitely not. That sometimes having an officer who is not from their community, who shows up, you know, that raises a lot of anxiety, you know, for them. But again, you might be, you know, sometimes if you're in an area where the majority of the, you know, there's some urban areas where there's a good handful of officers that reflect the community, and, you know, they come out and they're in uniform, and that raises anxiety. So I think that it's a combination of, you know, of thinking about the context of officers within that community. Who's going to go? Is it an officer? You know, all of those things are going to come into play, I think, as well.
And if I could just mention, the person that we initially, for the 400 project, hired a retired female homicide detective from Detroit. And by her own admission, sexual assault was not something she had background in or any significant interest in. We did do a lot of training and a lot of collaborative team building and that kind of thing as we began to engage in the project. And her experiences were absolutely fascinating to us, and we've since replicated that in looking at a cold case sex crimes unit that we're doing with our Attorney General's office, where again we had investigators come from homicides or property crimes who then were switching to cold case sex crimes. And in all of those cases, what we found was that officers or detectives didn't necessarily see that sexual assault was going to be any different until they got out there and started looking at those cases. And there was both the difference of it being a cold case versus a current case, and that sexual assault was so different than what they had dealt with before. And to a person, they've all said how much they have grown professionally and personally from the experience of learning to deal with it, and how that comfort level with the issue and really being able to understand why victims and survivors feel the way they do and how things affect them has broadened their thinking so much as a professional. So I think we can never underestimate the importance of training for people and supporting them and learning from each other by doing that broad stakeholder approach.
Okay, looks like we have, let's take one more. We're about 3:10 right now, a little bit over, but we started late. What are the roles of law enforcement-based or systems-based advocates in the cold case victim notification process in Detroit, Wayne County?
Can you ask the first part of that again?
What are the roles of law enforcement-based or systems-based advocates in the cold case victim notification process? So basically, how are you using advocates, either they're system-based or, well, law enforcement-based or system-based. So I guess she's asking about sort of advocates in law enforcement departments or prosecutor offices. How are they involved in the victim notification process? What are their roles?
Well, one of the things that we looked at, and when I say that everybody had some degree of blame, I look at our board, for instance, where we fund programs around the state in sexual assault. One of the places that I certainly think we had some culpability was that we were funding only one community-based sexual assault advocate in the city of Detroit. We funded a lot of work in domestic violence, but very little in sexual assault. And one of the reasons we didn't do that was because there is a very large victim assistance program in the Detroit Police Department to provide victim advocates in sexual assault situations. They actually meet victims at the primary hospital that they're taken to, and that there were prosecutor victim advocates. I think we've really come to a place now, I hope, as a community of recognizing that there are advantages to different kind of advocates, that while it can be very helpful to have victim advocates from the police department who are responding, as well as victim advocates through the court systems, that community-based advocates are an important and different type of advocate. And so our board has since then put in a great deal more money to hire and develop sexual assault advocate programs in the city of Detroit. So all three of those groups, victim advocates in the prosecutor's office, the police department, and community-based advocates, are involved at differing levels. And we try to ensure that all of those vantage points are taken into account in the work that we do. Just to be clear, the victim notification that we do in Detroit, the majority of the time, it is a law enforcement person who's actually notifying the victim and then immediately hooking her up with a community-based advocate or somebody from the police or prosecutor's office as an advocate, or combinations thereof.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. I think we are about out of time. We have a few questions that haven't been answered, but I don't know that they're completely appropriate to either one of you. If you want to send them, if the person who asked the question wants to send the question to me, I think I can find the right person to answer it for you. My contact information is here, as well as Debbie and Condencia's. I want to thank both of you for this conversation. I thought it was very enlightening. I learned a lot, and I hope our audience, I'm sure that they learned a lot as well. And feel free to contact Debbie or Condencia if you have any further questions or would like some more information. As soon as you sign off, an evaluation will pop up on your screen. Please fill that out for us so that we can continue to improve our webinars. And visit our DNA Resource Center at victimsofcrime.org/DNA, and you can sign up for other webinars and find all of our information, including the evidence retention chart, which we'll be posting shortly at that website. So I want to thank everyone for attending, and have a great afternoon.